It's hard to believe that when the Selkirk settlers arrived in Manitoba 200 years ago, and they were told, you can't farm in Western Canada. This is a land of ice and snow, it's fur country, and you can't farm here. It's not possible.
Funding for Built on Agriculture is provided in part by Manitoba Government, Growing Forward 2, a federal, provincial, territorial initiative, Government of Canada, MacDon Industries, Monsanto, Canada, the Bicentenary of the Red River Selkirk Settlement Committee, and the members of Prairie Public.
Manitoba is a spacious land, the easternmost part of the Prairie Provinces, located in the heart of Canada and the giant Hudson Bay watershed. Once known as Rupert's Land, it was called the Postage Stamp Province, and believed to be unsuitable for agriculture and only valuable for the fur trade. Who could imagine what this province would become?
The Highlands of Scotland, well into the 18th century, were a tribal society. We had clans, as everyone knows, and clans of chiefs, and the whole setup wasn't dissimilar to that of Native American society in North America. As the Industrial Revolution in Britain got underway and there was a huge demand for wool, the big product became sheep. To introduce sheep farming on a large scale into the Highlands necessitated getting rid of a lot of the people who were already there. Hence the Highland clearances. So there were mass evictions right across the entire northern part of Scotland.
Within the space of about 8 years, nearly every strath in the county of Sutherland had lost 95% of its indigenous population. They'd either moved to the coast to take up the small lots of land. They may have entered some of the industries like the fishing industries at Helmsdale. They also might have decided to go to the factories in places like Glasgow to work in the cotton industry.
These people, some of them were relocated onto the coast of Sutherland itself. Others moved to other parts of Britain. But increasingly these people, and Highlanders more generally, were emigrating to North America.
They would have heard these stories about the new lands in North America, land that you could have and it could be yours and yours alone, and it was free to you. If you worked hard, nobody would take it away from you. And this was something that must have been very enticing. I don't think Lord Selkirk probably knew who would take up his offer. It didn't take long, and Lord Selkirk heard that nearly 500 people in Kildonan had signed up.
Thomas Douglas was born on St. Mary's Isle in Kirkcudbright, Scotland, the youngest boy of 13 children.
Thomas, 5th Earl of Selkirk, was an idealist and a philanthropist, and he inherited vast sums of money because all of his brothers died young, and as a result he had a very large fortune, and he used that fortune to charter ships to take struggling Highlanders from Sutherland and other parts of the Highlands and Islands to Red River Settlement, which turned out to be the beginning of Winnipeg.
Well, I don't think you can live in Manitoba your whole life without knowing a little bit about Selkirk. I think the thing I admired most is that he had very strong principles about correcting wrongs. And I think he looked at the Scottish Highland clearances as a fundamental wrong.
He realized that he could do things now. He had money in his hands, and he had the knowledge and the imagination to do something. Almost at once, he became interested in some kind of immigration scheme that would take Highlanders to North America.
Well, he was a wealthy man. He had a very big stake in the Hudson's Bay Company, and he was able to obtain an extremely large area of land that was going to be used for settlement and farming, and of course the future expansion of farming would arise from it.
He was looking for some hardy, sturdy men to go and set up this new farming settlement in the middle of the prairies in Manitoba at a place called Red River. And this was the first agricultural settlement that was associated with the Hudson Bay Fur Trading Company. And it was quite an important part of the story. And this was really the initiative of Lord Selkirk.
A number of fur traders had told him about the promise of this area. And of course, one of the things that impressed them all was the dirt. The dirt is black. Everybody realized that this ain't like Scotland, right? Where the dirt is gray and sandy colored. This is good agricultural stuff.
It's clear that the company was on board because they sold him for 10 shillings, 116,000 square miles of land. Much of it, as we know, was magnificent land. It included southern Manitoba, reached into parts of North Dakota and South Dakota, reached into northwest Ontario, also into Saskatchewan. But the center of it was the place where the Red and the Assiniboine River come together, what we refer to as the Forks in Winnipeg.
Glacial Lake Agassiz retreated, leaving fertile soils in the Red River Valley.
Lake Agassiz formed then when glaciers which had occupied all of Canada and the northern tier of the United States, as they start to melt at the end of the last ice age, then huge amounts of meltwater are being formed. As the glaciers melt back into Canada, that meltwater then becomes trapped by higher land to the south, and it starts to form Lake Agassiz. And then as that ice continues to melt, the lake just continues to grow northward. Lake Agassiz then existed from about 13,000 years ago to about 8,500 years ago. The reason the lake is important then, these flat surfaces that we have in this area, as the melting at the northern end, they were supplying huge amounts of sediment from the glaciers into the lake. They convert then to clays, and so you get a very high preponderance then of clays and silts in the soils. So that with the freshly ground mineral matter that's in there, the potassium and all the other elements that are represented in those crushed up soils, that leads to generally good soils and soil development for good agriculture.
Native people are thought to have entered the area of Manitoba about 6,000 years ago, moving north from the southern plains. As nomadic people, they traveled to their food supply, primarily the bison herds. Over time, they found convenient places to settle for a while. One of those places was at the forks of the Red and the Assiniboine rivers, which became a well-known gathering place. A little north of the forks, Indigenous people began to plant crops like corn and potatoes. Here, the soil was rich and well-drained.
They would be eating a lot of vegetables, like plant foods, depending on the season. And as each season changed sort of thing, there were different animals that they were able to harvest because they weren't always living in the same location.
Well, the type of food that was eaten at that time was food that was plentiful. They go out and do community hunts, and then they would share all the meat that they brought back. But there was also berries that we also picked. With more Europeans coming, they had different foods, and then of course the Indigenous people had their foods as well. So there was this whole aspect of trading and sharing.
In 1812, the first party of settlers arrived and met unlivable conditions. No food, no shelter.
It was many hundreds, and they came over by ship to Hudson's Bay. Many of them landed at Churchill, then made their way down to the south, and eventually arrived at the Red River. And what they hadn't bargained for was the 5 months of ice and snow. And the friendship he formed with Chief Peguis of the First Nation Saulteaux meant that Chief Peguis would in fact protect them and the settlement.
Peguis took them under his wing, so to speak. I think he did a lot to help them survive the first few months and years, when a time when they weren't really adapted to this and weren't fully prepared for the kind of weather they encountered, the kind of activities that they could engage in, the fact that we had a much longer winter than they would have had in Scotland. He basically helped them get established.
Peguis was a hereditary chief, and he was very influential with the Europeans that were around the Forks here in the area of Winnipeg.
People often think that he had been here his whole life, but he wasn't. He had come here from the area of southern Ontario that we now say is sort of around Sault Ste. Marie. So in fact, I think maybe he had some special affinity for these people because, like him, they were newcomers, and now that he had become adapted to this area, he maybe felt some kind of kinship with them and that he had an obligation to help them get settled in too.
That's what I find so incredible about the Selkirk settler story, is that they persevered. And I think a lot of it had to do with owning a piece of land. Because they were driven off the land in Scotland, they were always tenants there. When they came to Canada, they were granted a piece of land. They knew that if they could stick with it, that this was going to be theirs, and no lord or no one else could evict you. The ownership of land and the respect for property, that was something that was really important to the Selkirk settlers, and why they were so determined to persevere in the face of all these hardships.
My ancestors arrived with the Lord Selkirk settlers. The first one to arrive here was my great-great-great-grandmother, and she arrived in late October in 1812. And her name was Catherine McGilvery, and she'd recently been married to Hector McLean. They arrived, it was a very, very rough time. That first winter, the settlers had to go down to Fort Dare, which is now Pembina, North Dakota, to winter because there was no food, there were no provisions made for them here. And they survived the winter, but Hector died the next spring. So here was Catherine, 20 years old, a widow with a baby, and she remained in the settlement. And several years later, she met a fur trader by the name of John Pritchard. And John Pritchard had been a fur trader with the Northwest Company, and he wanted to become a settler. He wanted to be affiliated with the Hudson's Bay Company. After a 24-hour courtship, they were married. They settled in Red River and had 10 children. And their daughter married a settler who came with the 1815 group, and that was John Matheson. So he and Catherine are my great-great-grandparents.
Miles MacDonnell had been sent to Red River as the advance man to establish housing and to source food for the expected settlers.
You know, I've never quite understood why Miles MacDonnell has the reputation that he has. When he brought the settlers here, they didn't really respect him at all. And he made somewhat dubious decisions. He was the one that issued the Pemmican Proclamation that said you couldn't take pemmican out of the settlement.
The main part of the Northwest Company's trade was much further north and west, and their concern was to feed canoe brigades, which had to go a very long way into the Northwest and come out again with the furs. And to do that, they used pemmican. It was basically a very high-calorie, high-protein food, which was ideal for fur brigades. I call it the fuel on which the fur brigades ran.
Pemmican Proclamation was designed to prevent provisions from leaving the settlement, and goodness knows the settlement needed all the provisions it could get. But the trouble was that it probably exceeded his authority. Moreover, it brought the wrath of the Northwest Company on its head.
What he was basically telling the Northwest Company was, you will have to shut down your pemmican operations. Well, they weren't going to do that, and so they began harassing the colony.
The hardships were huge. They had huge challenges. They were caught in the middle of a fur trade rivalry between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, and the Northwest Company wanted them gone, and they encouraged them in various ways to leave. Also, there was no food for them, and without the support of Chief Peguis and his people and the Métis buffalo hunters, they would have starved.
There was considerable tension between the Northwest Company and the settlers brought to the area by the Hudson Bay Company. The main economic activity in the area had been the fur trade. As the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company competed for furs, rivalry was the normal state of affairs and became even worse with the arrival of the settlers.
Everything boiled over in June of 1816. Cuthbert Grant and his group of Northwest Company followers were coming across the prairie at Seven Oaks, and Governor Semple and his group of settlers came out to meet them. There's a lot of controversy about what actually happened. A gun went off, and a fierce battle took place, and 22 of the settlers were killed that day.
Selkirk and his people always thought of it as a massacre. It probably wasn't. It was an inadvertent collision between settlers and mixed blood, but it was a very unequal encounter because the settlers were not militarily inclined. The mixed bloods were well armed and experienced shooters. Not surprisingly, the result was heavy loss of life on the settlers' part, virtually no loss of life on the mixed blood part.
After the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, peace came to Red River. But the challenges of droughts, pests, crop failures, and floods, like the devastating 1826 flood, persisted.
In 1826, we have the first of the great floods in recorded history in the Red River area. The Red River rises by 20 feet. Almost everybody lives on the banks of the rivers, and of course the settlement is virtually wiped out. Large numbers of settlers leave. But this is not necessarily a bad thing.
The colony did grow after 1817, not so much because there were new settlers coming in from Scotland, because there weren't very many, but the fur traders tended to retire here because this was a community and it had some characteristics of European life.
As a result of the merger of the two trading companies in the 1820s, there are a lot of surplus employees. The opportunity comes in 1826 to use the settlement as a place where retired members of the fur trade and their families can go.
It was a good place for the fur traders, who in general were married to women who were either natives or Métis, and who would probably have had a very difficult time retiring to Europe, where the society was so very different. So it was a good place to raise a family if you were a retired fur trader.
It's hard to believe that when the Selkirk settlers arrived in Manitoba 200 years ago, and they were told, you can't farm in Western Canada. This is a land of ice and snow, it's fur country, and you can't farm here. It's not possible. They were told that.
The big accomplishment of the settlement was to show that you could establish a farming economy on the prairies. The big thing about a farming settlement is the density of population. As soon as you start laying out the prairies in quarter section farms, you can have quite a big population.
So one of the reasons that Selkirk moves into this territory is an imperial motive. He's trying to preserve most of Western Canada and part of the Western United States from the rapacious Americans, who will otherwise take it over entirely.
So the settlement grew, and eventually, of course, it became Winnipeg. Canada took over the rest of the country in 1870. There was a policy of European immigration over the next 40 years, and all kinds of Europeans came out here who would never have been brought if it hadn't been known that it was possible to have this dense population with a farming settlement.
They started the waves of immigration that followed. And because the Selkirk settlers came here, others started to follow, and the Icelanders and Ukrainians and just every other group. Now there's the Philippine community, there's so many others who've come and make Manitoba home. We're very multicultural, perhaps because of the Selkirk settlers.
Settling the West for agriculture was a bold move. Early surveys had disagreed over the West's suitability for agriculture. Manitoba's new survey, beginning in 1871, created townships, of 36 square mile sections. Each section was 640 acres. This new method replaced the original Red River survey based on the early Quebec system of long, narrow river lots.
What, of course, sparked the settlement in any kind of numbers and in any kind of volume was the building of the CPR, which was completed in 1887. Sir John A. Macdonald's intention was to tie the country together and to tie Vancouver and British Columbia in with the eastern provinces. But of course, they had to cross the Great Plains to get there.
Sir John A. Macdonald, the good and the bad about him as our first Prime Minister. Some of the good things he did was he forced treaties to be signed. He also brought in a piece of legislation that allowed First Nations to vote in Eastern Canada. On the other hand, there was very aggressive practices on the government's side to displace people from the land and move them north, away from where the railroad was going to be. They basically used forced starvation to help relocate First Nation communities that would have had claims where the rail line was going to be.
Rail service made the settlement of the West a reality during the 1880s.
Sir John's national policy included the concept of settling the plains area and creating a rural farming economy there.
As an incentive to build a transcontinental rail line, the CPR had been granted a monopoly on rail line development.
Clifford Sifton was the Minister of Immigration. He, in many ways, determined which ethnic group was going to go where. So we ended up with the German, the Mennonite groups going into southern Manitoba, the Morden, Winkler, Altona area and the Steinbach area. They were essentially settling into areas that had good agricultural land, and they were able to be quite successful at it. Some of the Eastern European groups tended to get dumped off into southeast Manitoba in the poorer quality land, and yet they felt they still had good soil because it was better than what they had come from.
Between 1879 and 1881, 58,000 immigrants came to Manitoba. Settlement continued, and the late 1890s and early 1900s saw more than 30,000 immigrants from Ukraine. In 1896, Clifford Sifton spared no expense and increased advertising abroad.
These advertising claims in today's terms would be considered a scam because they essentially presented this area as a cornucopia. And we know that this environment that we work within here it's very harsh, but it's also very fragile. And so people came here with very high expectations of wealth and prosperity. And many of them had their hopes completely dashed within a very short period of time.
Homesteading in Canada was quite an organized affair. The railways financed construction through the capital assets of the land itself. The government granted the railways land. The railways surveys these lands on both sides of the rail line. They would sell these lands or bring people to these lands at homestead, their free quarter section, if you will. That would bring the population that the railways needed to create commerce. And it was a thriving business. The real boom of the 1880s through to really up to the 1920s.
The Canadian government wanted to get this vast prairie region settled, mainly because they didn't want the Americans to stake claim to it. And so they came up with this scheme with the railways in order to draw people to the area. And what it did was offer people essentially free land. They had to pay a $10 registration fee, but they had a free quarter section, 160 acres. What they had to do in order to get this land was to proof up or get 40 acres of their quarter section into production, and they had to build a permanent structure within 3 years. That was easier said than done in a part of the world where there weren't a lot of trees at the time. A lot of these people lived in sod huts for a significant number of years.
As a result of the government's programs, more than 3 million people came to Canada between 1896 and 1914. Selkirk passed away in 1820 and never got to see the success of his agricultural experiment.
He developed tuberculosis and died at a very early age, but the agreement he signed with Chief Pegwis of the First Nations Saulteaux had this sentence in it: the agreement would last for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow.
Manitoba was built on agriculture and the family farm. At the turn of the century, agriculture was the reason that the Manitoba Legislative Building is this huge, beautiful building, because it was booming. We were going to be the Chicago of the North.
Funding for Built on Agriculture is provided in part by Manitoba Government, Growing Forward 2, a federal, provincial, territorial initiative, Government of Canada, MacDon Industries, Monsanto, Canada, the Bicentenary of the Red River Selkirk Settlement Committee, and the members of Prairie Public.
To order a copy of the 4-part series Built on Agriculture, call 1-800-359-6900 or visit our online store at prairiepublic.org.